I'm here today because of a question. It's a question that occurred to me quite a long time ago. But it's a question that I want to share with you, hoping that it will embed itself in your mind the way it has mine. This is a question that has caused me to really look into the way I interact with people, and it's made me a better person. I had a 25-year radio career, and I was a news reporter and a sports announcer. And when you're in that role in a community, you have a front row seat to all the good and bad things that happen. I remember covering a fire that struck a family about a week before Christmas and wiped out everything they owned. They were okay, but they had nothing. And we turned the radio station lobby into a storage facility for all the donations that came in from people that were just reaching out to strangers. They were asking nothing in return, but utensils and pots and pans and clothes and toys and all the things that you would need just started to stack up there in the lobby. It was a beautiful reaction from the community. I remember a key person in our high school who suffered from cancer, and his diagnosis was not good. And we shaved our heads and raised a whole bunch of money in his name in order to just sort of hug he and his to-be widow to let them know one way or another everything was going to be okay. And I remember talking with family members of a soldier who was killed in Iraq, the wife and children of that man, not knowing what the future was going to be like and how devastating that was. And yet the road between the chapel and the VA cemetery was lined with thousands of people with flags and signs and messages of hope and love to a complete stranger as that hearse rolled by, and how much that meant to the family. The pattern was devastating tragedy followed by incredible togetherness over and over again. And I remember the first time this question occurred to me, and I asked a friend of mine, do you suppose it's possible we could skip the tragedy and just live in that togetherness? Is it possible for us to have togetherness without tragedy? And he gave me a sort of strange look, and from what I remember, left the room, and it kind of left the question hanging in the air, and it was sort of up to me to decide how to answer that question. And I've been trying to do that ever since. That was 15 years ago. And at first I tried to answer that question thinking about global tragedy and how difficult it is when something horrible happens across the globe and it spreads like in seconds, especially in our social media driven world. And I was looking for a way for us to respond with an event or something we could do that would provide an equal and opposite balance to this horrible thing that happened. And I had to quickly decide there just was nothing that could provide that kind of counterbalance to that tragic event. So I had to settle in my mind on the fact that togetherness without tragedy happens in small doses, like birthdays and anniversaries and weddings and babies being born and graduation ceremonies, and for some, state championships, national championships, world championships. But that was always involving a very small group of people, and it was short-lived usually. And in some cases, if you're not a sports fan, you couldn't enjoy and be part of that community. So although it wasn't a perfect answer, I felt like it was a partial answer to this question about togetherness without tragedy. But that question lay dormant for quite a long time because I felt like I couldn't really fully answer it back then. And it lay dormant until October 1st, 2015. And of course, that was the day when Umpqua Community College and our community was knocked to its knees by a horrible shooting tragedy that affected hundreds, if not thousands, of people in this community. And for a lot of us, the recovery still continues. It may continue for many, many years. And people here tend to have a UCC recovery story. My UCC recovery story centers around an organization called UCC Strong. That was the name given to a fund that $1.3 million came into from complete strangers around the world trying to do something to help the victims of that shooting. And we had to assemble, the United Way had to assemble, and I helped them, a group of about 15 people to manage this fund because while it's easy to give money away, it's hard to do it responsibly. And under the potential scrutiny of all kinds of people who would be more than happy to sue us These 15 people dedicated themselves to the cause of distributing that money to the victims. And I remember the first time that group of people was together in the room for the first time, and I was just thinking, how is this going to work? We have people from such different points of view. You had philanthropists and wealthy business people in the same room with students. You had a mental health professional and a pastor. You had people that just normally don't associate with one another. Labels just all around the room. And it was amazing to watch that group of people put those labels down and focus on the goal and distribute that money and do it well the way we were hoping. And they did it because there was something greater than them at stake. They didn't ask anything in return. They just did the job, and they did it very, very well. They put those labels aside. If you think about it, there was also young and old and liberal and conservative, gay and straight, tattooed and untattooed. Plenty of reasons for people to not get along, and yet they did such an amazing job. And it was an excellent example of togetherness and the sort of thing that I think about when I thought about togetherness. Of course, the catalyst for that was tragedy. I want to do an experiment with you on labels. Just look at me. I'm a white, middle-aged, middle-class, educated, straight, married, Christian, conservative, Republican American man. And I just divided the room. Some of you will say, that's the kind of guy I'd like to get to know. But for some other people, you wouldn't want to even talk to me because of the labels I just laid out there. But you know what? It goes further than that. For some people, the labels I just laid out create fear. And when I think about those labels, I have to wonder, why do we pay so much attention to labels? Is it because we just really want to have a relationship with and trust the people that are just like us? Who do you see only as labels? Or who do you not see because you've put a label on them? Following my UCC experience, I was able to go speak to some leaders in other communities, and they would ask me, what could we learn from what you went through in Roseburg? And I started talking about leaders and the role leaders would play in recovery if a tragedy, and eventually one will hit, a tragedy hit that community. What should leaders do? And I would always tell them, I think the thing you should do is think about the people who would be around the table to help your community recover if something were to happen. Think about the other leaders that would be there. You probably know some of them, but you may only know of others. You should reach out to those other leaders and get to know them a little bit before you're forced to find out if you can trust them or like them under the pressure of recovery. And it really seemed to resound with people. They really liked that idea, and we came up with the phrase of togetherness before tragedy, which awakened that whole discussion about togetherness without tragedy. But there was also a incomplete part to this whole thing as well, because if only leaders are able to help us get to togetherness without tragedy, we're missing out on a whole nother section of people. We need everyone involved in order for togetherness without tragedy to become a reality. And so the idea lay dormant again for a while, until I found the kindness diaries. One day I was flipping through looking for something to watch on Netflix, and I came across the first episode of the Kindness Diaries, and I was fascinated. The Kindness Diaries depict the effort of a stockbroker from Britain who happened to live in Los Angeles, who got tired of being a stockbroker. And his idea was, even though the world looks like a very bad place from a distance, there still is kindness in this world. He just wanted to go find it. And so he conducted an amazing experiment, which is documented in this series. What he did was he got into a canary yellow motorcycle with a sidecar and began driving across the United States with the goal of going around the world on nothing but the kindness of strangers. He had no money for fuel, food, or lodging. He was going to rely completely on people. Now, what he did have was the ability to gift people with a life-changing gift that would help them change their lives because of the incredible kindness that they showed. Of course, they didn't know. It's kind of an undercover boss thing. So Leon took off, headed east. And one of the first episodes, he comes across a man named Richard who lives in Pittsburgh. and it's getting late and getting dark, and Leon needs a place to stay, and he runs into Richard, and he asks Richard if he could stay with him for the night, and Richard said, "Sure, absolutely, but I'm homeless." And Leon said, "That's fine." So Leon spent the night in the doorway that Richard lives in. And Richard gave Leon his mat and his blankets and some food, and they laid there talking all night long. And Richard told his story. Before he became homeless, he had a dream of being a chef. But he had dropped out of culinary school as his path to homelessness. In the morning, Richard gave Leon 3 pairs of underwear and more food for his trip. And Leon told Richard that he was going to pay for Richard to go back to school so he could complete his dream of being a chef. And he did. 15 episodes of that. Inspirational. Get the Kleenex ready. It's awesome. Well, I was so inspired, I reached out to Leon through his Facebook page and website, and I was able actually to exchange some emails with him. And eventually, he and I Skyped for about a half hour one day while he was in New York. I told him about Togetherness Without Tragedy. I asked him if he thought it had legs, and could I do something on the same level as the Kindness Diaries, and he encouraged me to do so. And his number one piece of advice to me was be the change. Be the change I wanted to see. And we've all heard that, and I really took that to heart. Now, I have been the change a little bit on this. I was part of a group of people that did a thing called Adopt a Block here in Roseburg for a couple of years. We went up and down Mill Street with rakes and shovels and weed whackers and lawnmowers and garbage bags, just knocking on doors and asking people if there were odd jobs that we could do for no pay. We just wanted to do something to help the neighborhood out, mostly to get to know people in case there was something bad that happened, because we thought maybe we could help them out. And amazing things happened during that time. There's 2 stories to share. One, there was a house we knocked on the door, nobody would ever come to the door. We could hear TV, but nobody would ever come to the door. Months went by. The neighbor came to us one day and said, "That fella fell down and broke his hip and his back, and he's coming back in a wheelchair, and there's no ramp. He can't get into his house." So we built a ramp for him. We met a woman who was raising her grandson because his father had bailed out on drugs. She was sleeping on the floor of her house. She had diverticulitis so bad, she was headed to surgery. She was miserable. She gave the only mattress in the house to her 8-year-old grandson. And when we heard that story, we made sure she had a twin mattress, and you would have thought we gave her a new house. We didn't ask for anything in return. It was simply a gesture that needed to be done. So I understand be the change. But as I thought about it more, actually what this became was be the catalyst. Be the catalyst began to ring in my head, trying to answer that question of togetherness without tragedy. Be the catalyst. Well, in scientific terms, a catalyst is an element that's introduced to an environment that changes that environment. Well, let's talk about the environment we want to change. We live in an isolated, anonymous, angry, label-throwing, argumentative, divided, angry world right now, just begging for something to change, begging for something to believe in, begging to be part of something that we can all be a part of, something better than what we have right now. And if we choose not to make any changes, we're just going to go ahead and continue to add to all of those bad things. In fact, if we don't make a change deliberately, really what we may be saying is we'll just wait for the tragedy to come along before we make a change in how we treat one another. But there's another option, and that option is to make a deliberate decision to be the change, to drop the labels the way they did at UCC Strong and the preconceived notions that come along with them, to manufacture kindness the way Leon Logothetes did with the Kindness Diaries, and then to go out and look for opportunities in your own way to generate and encourage togetherness without tragedy.